Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today we are taking a deep dive into Half-Hanged Mary, the woman who survived her own execution. Most ghost stories begin after someone dies, but this one begins because she didn't. Picture Western Massachusetts in the late 1600s, a tiny Puritan settlement called Hadley, with dense forests pressing against the edge of civilization. They had long winters, candlelight, and sermons about sin, Satan, and God's judgment. And the people of this town believed that the devil walked among them, not figuratively, but literally. Every failed harvest, every unexplained illness, every child's death, and every strange noise in the night. Someone had to be responsible for all these things. And if you couldn't find the devil, you found a woman, and that woman's name was Mary Webster. And history would remember her as Half-Hanged Mary. Mary was in her 50s. That was considered quite old back then. And her life had already become a slow-motion tragedy long before she saw the noose. Her father-in-law had been John Webster, one of the founders of Hadley and the governor of the Connecticut colony. But when he died, the family's fortunes collapsed. They lived between the cemetery and the town pond and survived mostly on charity. And to the townspeople, they had become poor, dependent, and different. And then there was Mary herself. She wasn't meek, she wasn't quiet, and she wasn't grateful. And according to historians, Mary had a temper. She argued, stood her ground, in a society where women were expected to lower their heads. But Mary, she refused, and that may have been her greatest crime. Soon the strange stories began. Get this, a farmer claimed that his horses refused to pass by her house, which meant that obviously Mary had done something to the horses and bewitched them. If an animal acted strange, if a child became sick, or even if milk spoiled, if there was anything that they simply could not explain, somebody would whisper her name. Then the accusations grew stranger. One story claimed that an infant was lifted from its crib and slammed back down 3 times. And this was blamed on Mary simply because she was in the house, not even in this room. And someone else claimed that bruises on Mary's own body were proof that she was doing some kind of witchcraft. And the women who made these claims that she was a witch simply because she had bruises, what they didn't know was it was their own husbands who were beating this poor woman. Women would publicly search her body, looking for what they called the devil's marks. Could you imagine living in a place where your neighbors believed that a bruise on your arm was evidence that you've done something wrong? Then, in 1683, Mary was arrested for witchcraft. She was sent far away from her home to Boston to await trial. She stayed in a very small cell in Boston for over 6 months, awaiting trial. Now, she was fed very rarely, but when she was fed, she was given moldy bread. And get this, the water that they had for her was just stagnant. And when Mary went to trial, witness after witness came forward saying that she worked alongside Satan himself. But something remarkable happened. The jury actually took the time to listen to Mary and found her not guilty. So she walked free. Now, most stories would end here on a positive note, but this one's only getting started. Now, Mary was poor. She didn't have much, so the only choice she had was to return to the only home that she ever knew. And the resentment from the people in town only grew. One of her loudest accusers was a respected military man by the name of Philip Smith. Then, suddenly, Smith became horribly ill. His symptoms terrified everyone in town, and he himself claimed that Mary stood over his bed every single night. He would claim that Mary was stabbing him with invisible pins, and people also reported hearing scratching coming from beneath his sheets. Then his bed would shake so violently that men from town couldn't hold it still. And flames supposedly burst across the mattress before disappearing. His medicine vanished, and something the size of a cat raced across his bed. But when the covers were pulled back, there was nothing there. So there was a guy named Cotton Mather's. He was a famous Puritan minister, and he recorded these events. He used them as evidence that supernatural forces were attacking Smith. And today, some people wonder whether Smith was suffering from delirium, high fever, or maybe a neurological illness. But in 1684, there was another explanation. You guessed it, Mary Webster. Here's where the story becomes almost impossible to believe. Philip Smith reportedly slept easier when men from town would visit Mary. That word may sound harmless now, but it wasn't. Historical accounts say that these men regularly beat her all night. Now keep in mind, this woman is in her 50s now, and you've got these men just going into her house in the middle of the night, beating her. And could you imagine actually believing that violence against one woman would cure another man's sickness? Even worse, the entire community agreed with these actions. A point in time came where they thought that beating her wasn't enough. So a mob of grown men marched to Mary's home. Now, it was winter. They marched to her home, drug her outside, wrapped a rope around her neck, and hanged her. When they believed that she was almost dead, they cut her down and rolled her down a snow-covered hill. At the bottom of the hill, they buried her and left her there. There was no trial, there was no jury, there was no mercy. Just her neighbors convinced that they were doing God's work. And you might think once again, this is where the story ends. But it's not, because by morning, Mary Webster had climbed out of that grave. It is difficult to overstate how crazy that must have seemed. The woman that they believed was a witch had successfully survived an execution. To some, that wasn't proof of innocence. That was proof that she was, in fact, a witch, and not entirely human. Meanwhile, Philip Smith died anyway. Once again, they came for her, wrapped a noose around her neck, and hanged her from a tree. They stood there while she hanged, laughing and mocking her. And when they assumed she was dead, they simply walked away. Now again, you might think this is the end of the story, but it is not. The next morning they came to cut down her corpse. However, when her body hit the ground, she began to cough and wheeze. She was still alive. So one of the reasons that they believed that she was a witch was because Mary tended to the women in town. She would provide midwife services, herbal contraceptives, and even abortions. And when the women in town got a little nervous that she might actually be a witch, they started confessing things to their husbands, things that they had been doing that their husbands were not aware of. And that's one of the things that further sparked so much hate against Mary. So back to the most recent hanging. After that, she managed to get home. She nursed her wounds and recovered and lived another 11 years. And she lived out the rest of her days in that very same town with those very awful people who hated her. Mary did eventually die in 1690, and she was buried in Hadley's old cemetery. However, the townspeople, they made sure that her grave was unmarked. They tried to erase what happened there, but it didn't work. Now here's a twist that you may not have seen coming. Centuries later, the author, Margaret Atwood, yes, that Margaret Atwood, discovered that she was a descendant of Mary's. That revelation truly haunted her, and she later dedicated The Handmaid's Tale to Mary. And she also wrote a poem titled Half-Hanged Mary, from Mary's point of view, imagining what it would feel like to survive your own execution. And a line from that poem reads, "Most will have only one death. I will have two." So, was Mary Webster really a witch? There is no evidence that she practiced witchcraft, summoned demons, or cast spells. There's no evidence that she didn't. However, there is plenty of evidence that fear can become contagious, that poverty, simply being poor, can become suspicious, that an outspoken woman can become dangerous simply by not remaining silent. Sometimes the real monster isn't hiding in the forest. Sometimes it's the crowd standing beneath the gallows, absolutely certain that they are the good guys. And maybe that's why the legend of half-hanged Mary still refuses to die. Because ghosts, they don't always haunt the places where people were murdered. Sometimes they haunt the places where ordinary people convince themselves that murder was justice. So my only question for you is, are you scared yet? That's going to do it for today. I will see you all next time.